People call me a cruel, ungrateful daughter who destroyed her own family's reputation for revenge. And honestly, they forced me to become exactly that. When you throw out your pregnant 17-year-old daughter like trash, don't be surprised when she grows up to be your worst nightmare. My name is Aurora Whitfield, and at 39, I thought I'd already taken all the hits life had in store for me. I grew up as the responsible daughter, worked 2 jobs through college, while my parents built their empire on the backs of people they considered beneath them, and that taught me a lot about cruelty. But when they threw me out pregnant at 17, calling me a disgrace who would destroy their reputation, they crossed a line that would later destroy them completely. I grew up in Cherry Hills Village, the most exclusive area of Denver, Colorado. My father, Theodore Whitfield, was CEO of Whitfield Industries, the construction company that built half of downtown Denver. My mother, Vivian, was the queen bee of Denver society, hosting charity galas where she raised money while looking down on the people she was supposedly helping. From the outside, we were the perfect American family. Sprawling mansion with mountain views, manicured gardens, and parents who graced the cover of Denver magazine as Power Couple of the Year. But inside those marble walls, reality was different. I was expected to be perfect, silent, and grateful for the privilege of being a Whitfield. When I brought home an A-, my father asked why it wasn't an A+ while reviewing quarterly reports at the dinner table. When I won 2nd place in the state science fair, my mother wondered aloud why I hadn't worked harder for 1st place while planning her next society luncheon. At 16, I got my first job at a coffee shop near the University of Denver, not because I needed money, but because I needed to breathe. Away from the suffocating expectations, away from conversations about stock portfolios and social standings, away from parents who saw me as another acquisition to polish and display. Have you ever felt like your family sees you more as a reflection of their success than as a person? Like every mistake you make somehow damages that perfect family image they've built? Tell me in the comments what you would do in my place, if you discovered your parents care more about what others think than about your life. And if this sounds familiar, hit that subscribe button because you'll understand exactly why I became the nightmare they never saw coming. At 17, I fell in love with Jasper Kane, the boy who promised me forever while his parents planned his Stanford acceptance. When I told him I was pregnant, he looked at me like I'd just destroyed his entire future, which, according to his parents' lawyers, I had. When I refused to fix the problem as he suggested, Jasper blocked my number, deleted our photos from social media, and told everyone at school I'd been sleeping around. His parents had already prepared a statement for Stanford about the unfortunate situation with the unstable girl who was trying to trap their son. So, I went home to my parents with a positive pregnancy test and the naive belief that family meant unconditional love. I stood in our marble foyer, the one featured in Architectural Digest, and told the 2 people who should have protected me that I needed their help. My father's reaction was swift and brutal. 10 minutes to pack, a legal document to sign, and the promise they'd tell people I was studying abroad. Little did they know that while I was the one signing that paper under duress, they would be the ones paying the consequences. That was the death certificate they gave me as their daughter that night. I'll never forget sleeping in Washington Park that first night, using my suitcase as a pillow while snow started falling around midnight. The gazebo where Jasper first kissed me became my shelter, which felt like some cruel joke the universe was playing on me. 3 days later, I woke up to someone gently shaking my shoulder. I expected a cop or worse, but instead found this elegant woman in her 70s, wearing a cashmere coat and looking at me with genuine concern, not judgment. Magnolia Ashworth had been walking her ancient poodle, Gatsby, at dawn, a routine she'd kept since her husband died 5 years earlier. She saw me curled up on that bench, 17 and obviously pregnant, and something in her just broke open. When I tried to insist I was fine through chattering teeth, she sat right there on that cold bench beside me, not caring about her expensive coat. She asked when I'd last had a real meal, and that's when I started crying, really crying. Not the silent tears I'd been rationing for 3 days. This complete stranger was showing me more kindness than my own parents ever had. She didn't ask a million questions or lecture me about my choices. She just said we were making breakfast and always made too much. Her car smelled like lavender, and felt like heaven with those heated seats. She drove us to this gorgeous house in Cherry Hills Village, just a few neighborhoods over from where I'd grown up, but it might as well have been another planet. Magnolia told me she'd lost her daughter in a car accident 5 years ago. Sage had been pregnant too, about my age. The room she showed me wasn't just a guest room. It was a nursery waiting to happen. A white crib sat assembled in the corner, and the closet was full of maternity clothes with tags still on them. She said this was mine now. No questions, no conditions, no judgment. Everyone deserved a second chance, especially when the first chance got stolen from them. When I asked why she was doing this, she touched a photo of Sage and said her daughter would have wanted her to help. That night, I slept in a real bed for the first time in almost a week. Gatsby curled up at my feet like a fuzzy guardian angel, and I finally felt safe enough to dream about the future instead of just surviving each day. Phoenix arrived during a February blizzard, screaming and perfect and absolutely determined to make his entrance dramatic. Magnolia held my hand through 18 hours of labor, whispering encouragement when I had nothing left. She declared he was going to change the world, and I could see it in his eyes already. She wasn't wrong. Phoenix walked at 9 months, was reading chapter books at 3, and by kindergarten teachers were calling him gifted. While I worked toward my GED and eventually college courses online, he absorbed knowledge like other kids absorbed cartoons. Magnolia owned 3 successful restaurants in Denver, and she started teaching me the business from the ground up. Not just hosting tables, but inventory, scheduling, profit margins, everything. She'd tell me I wasn't just working there, I was learning to build my own empire, one that nobody could ever take away from me. By 7, Phoenix was performing surgery on his stuffed animals with real sutures he'd learned from YouTube videos. At 10, he was reading my anatomy textbooks for fun. At 15, Harvard Medical School accepted him with early admission. At 22, he became the youngest department head in Colorado history. That same year, Sterling Blackwood walked into Pemberton's downtown during lunch rush. He was updating Magnolia's will, something she insisted on doing every year since taking us in. Tall, steady, with kind eyes and terrible dad jokes that made me laugh despite myself. After 20 years of focusing only on Phoenix and work, I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone look at me like I was interesting, not just Phoenix's mom. Over coffee that somehow turned into dinner, Sterling mentioned that Magnolia had told him something interesting about her will. Something about protecting the family you choose over the family that abandoned you. Even then, Magnolia was planning ahead, making sure Phoenix and I would be protected from people who might try to claim us after throwing us away. Everything changed when the Denver Post ran that headline about Phoenix becoming the youngest department chief in state history. His photo covered half the front page. My brilliant son in surgical scrubs standing in front of the cardiac wing he was already revolutionizing. The article mentioned his full name, Dr. Phoenix Whitfield, MD, PhD. My maiden name. The name my parents thought they'd buried 22 years ago. Within hours, the story went viral with headlines about the prodigy doctor and real-life Doogie Howser transforming Denver medicine. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't check the voicemail, but something made me listen. My mother's voice after more than 2 decades of silence, saying they needed to discuss their grandson. Not my son, not Phoenix, but their grandson, like he was property they'd suddenly remembered they owned. The emails started next, sent to the restaurant's public address. Professional, cold corporate messages about recent news, bringing Phoenix's achievements to their attention. As his grandparents, they felt it was time to reconnect and discuss his future as part of the Whitfield legacy. They signed it with their business email. Whitfield Industries, the company they'd protected by throwing me away like trash. Sterling found me crying in my office, not from sadness, but from pure rage. I told him they wanted Phoenix now that he was successful, after 22 years of nothing. He asked what I wanted to do, and I said make them disappear again without hesitation. Sterling said we could do that, but first he wanted to check something in Magnolia's papers. She'd mentioned specific provisions for exactly this situation. That night, Phoenix worked a 16-hour shift saving 2 lives, completely unaware that his biological grandparents existed, let alone that they were circling like vultures who'd spotted gold. They started small, like predators testing their prey. A reservation at Pemberton's downtown under a fake name, sitting in my section, watching me work with scientific intensity. I recognized my mother's emerald ring before her face. She'd aged badly, 22 years of bitterness fighting a losing battle against Botox. My father told me they knew exactly who I was and needed to discuss Phoenix. When I said they needed to leave, they didn't. Instead, packages started arriving at the hospital. A Rolex Submariner for Phoenix, Mont Blanc pens, first edition medical texts worth thousands. Each card signed, "Your loving grandparents." Phoenix brought them home confused, asking if he should be worried about someone sending him expensive gifts. I told him to return them all immediately. Sterling intercepted their legal letter requesting grandparent visitation rights under Colorado law. He laughed as he read it, explaining they were citing established family bonds that they'd legally severed 22 years ago. They didn't just kick me out. They'd disowned me and any children I might have in writing, with witnesses and notarization. But they kept pushing. They hired private investigators, contacted hospital boards, tried getting invited to fundraising events by introducing themselves as Dr. Whitfield's grandparents. The final straw came when my mother approached Phoenix directly at a coffee shop, telling him he looked just like his grandfather, and claiming to be family while my mother had supposedly kept them apart. Phoenix called me immediately about the woman who'd ambushed him, asking if he should call security. I said yes, always call security when strangers claim to be family. Then Jasper called at 2 a.m. because he always had terrible timing. After 22 years of silence, he still thought his voice would mean something to me. He'd seen the news about Phoenix and wanted to discuss their son. When I pointed out Phoenix didn't know he existed, Jasper talked about being young and threatened by his parents. But then he admitted the truth. My parents had contacted him, thinking if he was involved, I'd be more receptive to reconciliation. They were offering to help him financially if he could convince me to let them see Phoenix. After I hung up, I called Sterling to tell him about the coordination between my parents and Jasper. He said conspiracy leaves evidence and asked me to forward everything. The next morning, Jasper's email about parental rights had proof hidden in the signature. Consultant, Whitfield Industries Family Relations. They'd hired the man who abandoned me to manipulate me into giving them access to Phoenix. The retaliation started within days, and it was more vicious than I'd expected. My father launched a full-scale character assassination campaign throughout Denver's elite circles, and his decades of reputation gave his lies immediate credibility. I learned about it from my friend Rebecca, who still had connections in Cherry Hills Village. She told me my father had been spreading stories about his ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned family after becoming successful, refusing to help when they needed medical advice, turning her back on blood out of pure selfishness. According to his version, they were heartbroken parents trying to reconnect with the brilliant grandson they'd helped raise, only to be coldly rejected by a daughter who'd forgotten her roots. The story spread through Denver's social circles like wildfire. My mother played her part perfectly, showing up to charity luncheons with tears in her eyes, telling anyone who'd listen how devastated she was about being kept from their grandson. She'd raised me with such hope, given me every opportunity, only to watch me turn cruel and vindictive. The community response was swift and brutal. Former neighbors whispered about me with disgust. Society pages ran pieces about family loyalty clearly aimed at me. Even extended family members posted social media comments about honoring parents, obviously directed my way. Clients at the restaurants made pointed comments about family obligations while I served their tables. My father had used his position to isolate me completely, turning my self-protection into proof of moral failure. The legal letter arrived Friday by certified mail. Grandparent visitation rights under Colorado statutes, claiming Phoenix needed stability and wisdom that only biological grandparents could provide. Sterling read it with amusement, explaining they were citing family bonds they'd legally severed 22 years ago. He spread the original abandonment papers across our table like murder trial evidence. They hadn't just disowned me, they'd specifically relinquished rights to any children I might have. Phoenix legally didn't exist to them, but they weren't finished. Their private investigator got bolder, approaching Phoenix's hospital colleagues, asking about his family background and finances. They contacted news stations suggesting stories about family reconciliation and medical dynasties. The breaking point came when I discovered they were spreading rumors about my mental health, suggesting my abandonment issues made me unfit to influence such a promising young doctor. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with disappointed parents anymore. We were dealing with people who'd convinced themselves Phoenix belonged to them, that his success validated their version of family, and I was just an obstacle to eliminate. They'd taught me that family was about power and control. Now they were about to learn I'd become an excellent student of their lessons. The war escalated when they made their biggest mistake. Instead of backing down after Sterling's legal warnings, they decided to go public with their sob story. Channel 7 ran a segment about estranged grandparents fighting for access to their medical prodigy grandson. My mother appeared on camera in her best St. John suit, dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief while talking about forgiveness and second chances. My father stood beside her looking dignified in his Harvard tie. The grieving grandfather denied access to his only grandchild. They painted themselves as victims of my cruelty. Generous parents who'd made mistakes when I was young but had spent decades trying to make amends. The interview ended with my mother looking directly into the camera, begging me to stop punishing Phoenix for their past errors. The segment went viral within hours. Comments poured in supporting them, calling me heartless for keeping family apart. My parents had weaponized public opinion against me, counting on people's sympathy for loving grandparents over the ungrateful daughter who'd forgotten her place. But what they didn't know was that going public had been exactly what Sterling was hoping they'd do. Every lie they told on camera, every false claim about trying to reconnect, every manipulation tactic they used was now documented evidence of harassment, and Magnolia's will had very specific instructions about what to do, with family members who publicly humiliated her chosen daughter. Their media campaign backfired spectacularly, but not in the way I expected. Instead of public support forcing me to reconcile, it triggered something they never saw coming. 3 former employees came forward with stories about Theodore Whitfield's business practices that made the news stations very interested in investigating further. Apparently, when you put yourself on television claiming to be a victim, reporters start digging into whether you're actually the victim or the victimizer. And my father's decades of cutting corners, exploiting workers, and using his reputation to cover questionable dealings suddenly had a spotlight on them. The first whistleblower was Maria Santos, a former Whitfield Industries project manager who'd been fired for questioning safety violations on a downtown construction site. She'd kept detailed records of every conversation, every ignored safety report, every worker injury that got covered up to keep projects on schedule. The second was James Chen, an accountant who discovered my father had been billing the city for materials never delivered and labor never performed. When James tried to report it internally, he was terminated for performance issues and blacklisted from other firms. The third was the one that really destroyed them. Patricia Williams, my father's former executive assistant for 15 years, came forward with documentation showing he'd been systematically underpaying immigrant workers while claiming full wages on government contracts, pocketing the difference. These weren't new issues. They were part of a pattern going back decades. But nobody had felt safe speaking out against Theodore Whitfield until he made the mistake of painting himself as a sympathetic figure on television while attacking his own daughter. Sterling worked 18-hour days coordinating with the journalists, providing legal protection for the whistleblowers, and connecting dots between various incidents spanning 20 years. Every document Patricia had secretly copied, every safety report Maria had saved, every financial discrepancy James had tracked. It all painted a picture of systematic corruption. The Denver district attorney announced a formal investigation into Whitfield Industries. The Colorado Department of Labor opened multiple cases. The IRS started auditing 20 years of tax returns. The state licensing board began reviewing every project my father's company had ever touched. My parents' perfect reputation crumbled in less than 2 weeks. The charity boards asked them to step down. The country club revoked their membership. Former business partners distanced themselves so fast it was almost comical. But the most satisfying part was watching my father's attempts to control the narrative completely backfire. Every time he tried to claim these were attacks by disgruntled former employees, more evidence surfaced. Every time my mother tried to play the victim on social media, someone would comment with links to the investigative reports. Phoenix finally learned the truth about his biological grandparents from a Denver Post article titled "Construction Magnates, Empire Built on Worker Exploitation." He called me from the hospital break room. His voice carefully controlled the way it got when he was processing difficult information. He told me he'd always wondered why I never talked about my parents, but he'd assumed it was grief over their deaths or some kind of family tragedy. He'd never imagined they were alive and had thrown me out pregnant as a teenager. He asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if there was something he could do to help. That's my son. Facing the news that his success had attracted predators claiming to be family, and his first concern was whether I needed support. Sterling found me crying after that call, but they were good tears for once. Phoenix knew the truth now, and he'd chosen us over them without hesitation. We were finally safe from people who saw him as property instead of family. But Magnolia had left one final surprise in her will, something even Sterling hadn't known about until the lawyers called. A foundation she'd established years ago, specifically designed to help young mothers who'd been abandoned by their families, and the person she'd named to run it, with full control over $15 million in assets, was me. The irony was perfect. The woman who'd saved me from sleeping in parks had ensured I'd have the resources to save other girls from the same fate. Meanwhile, my parents were losing everything they'd built while trying to claim credit for success they'd never supported. Justice isn't always immediate, but sometimes it's absolutely perfect. Now that I had my parents' campaign against me and their coordination with Jasper fully documented, I thought these successful business people would recognize they'd overplayed their hand and retreat quietly. But when you back people into a corner who've spent decades building their reputation on being untouchable, well, desperate people do desperate things. What would you do if your own parents started a public media campaign painting you as a cruel daughter who abandoned family, all because you refused to let them exploit your son's success? The investigation into Whitfield Industries moved faster than anyone expected. Within 3 weeks, my father's construction empire was completely dismantled. Federal agents raided their offices, seizing decades of falsified documents, fraudulent billing records, and evidence of systematic worker exploitation. The most damaging revelation came from Patricia Williams' files. She'd documented every illegal practice for 15 years, keeping meticulous records of bribes paid to city inspectors, safety violations that caused worker injuries, and immigrant employees who were paid half wages while my father claimed full amounts on government contracts. Sterling worked around the clock, coordinating with prosecutors and journalists. Every piece of evidence painted a picture of a man who'd built his reputation on the suffering of people who couldn't fight back. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd thrown out his pregnant teenager daughter to protect the same reputation he'd been destroying through criminal activity for decades. My mother tried desperately to distance herself from the company, claiming she'd known nothing about Theodore's business practices. But Patricia's records showed Vivian had signed off on several questionable transactions, and had personally approved the firing of whistleblowers who'd tried to report safety violations. The Denver elite, who'd embraced my parents' sob story about their estranged daughter, suddenly couldn't distance themselves fast enough. Charity boards asked them to resign immediately. The country club revoked their membership overnight. Former business partners released statements condemning their practices. Phoenix watched the news coverage with the analytical detachment he brought to complex surgeries. He told me he'd always wondered why I never talked about my family, but he'd assumed they were dead, or we'd had some tragic falling out. Learning they were alive and had thrown out their pregnant daughter was disturbing, but discovering they were criminals who'd exploited vulnerable workers was genuinely shocking. The Colorado Department of Labor filed 17 separate violations against Whitfield Industries. The IRS announced they were auditing 20 years of tax returns. The state licensing board began reviewing every project the company had ever completed, with several government buildings now requiring structural inspections. My father's legal team tried everything to contain the damage. They claimed he was being targeted because of the media attention around our family drama. They suggested the whistleblowers were disgruntled former employees seeking revenge. They even tried to argue that I had orchestrated the entire scandal to hurt my parents financially. But Sterling had prepared for their desperation. Every document was authenticated, every witness was protected, and every claim was backed by years of evidence. There was no conspiracy theory that could explain away 2 decades of systematic fraud and exploitation. The most satisfying moment came when Channel 7 ran a follow-up story titled, "Construction Empire Built on Worker Exploitation." The what? Same reporter who'd given my parents a platform to attack me now detailed their criminal activities with the same thorough coverage. My parents went from sympathetic grandparents, denied access to their grandson, to convicted criminals facing federal charges for fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. Their transformation in public perception was complete and irreversible. Justice had finally found Theodore and Vivian Whitfield, and it was more thorough than anything I could have planned myself. While my parents faced criminal charges, Sterling discovered something extraordinary in Magnolia's final papers. She'd established a foundation years before her death, specifically designed to help young mothers abandoned by their families, and she'd named me as the sole administrator with complete control over $15 million. The Elena Ashworth Foundation for Young Mothers had been quietly accumulating assets for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to launch. Magnolia had instructed her lawyers to reveal it only after Phoenix achieved significant success, ensuring we'd have the resources to help others without being vulnerable ourselves. Reading her detailed instructions felt like receiving a letter from beyond the grave. She'd anticipated every possible scenario, including family members who might try to claim credit for Phoenix's success or exploit our newfound stability. The foundation was legally protected from any interference by biological relatives who'd previously abandoned their children. The first beneficiary was waiting for us already. Juniper Martinez, 17 years old, had been thrown out by her parents when they discovered her pregnancy. She'd been living in her car for 2 weeks when a social worker connected her with our new foundation. Meeting Juniper felt like looking into a mirror from 22 years ago. The same terror in her eyes, the same desperate hope that someone might help, the same determination to protect her unborn child despite impossible circumstances. But unlike me, she wouldn't have to sleep in parks or depend on the random kindness of strangers. We arranged immediate housing in a foundation-owned apartment, complete with everything she'd need for herself and her baby: medical care, child care, educational support, job training, whatever it took to build a stable future. The program was designed to give young mothers exactly what I'd found with Magnolia, but systematically and permanently. Phoenix threw himself into the foundation work with the same intensity he brought to cardiac surgery. He established partnerships with Denver hospitals to provide free prenatal care, worked with universities to create flexible education programs, and developed job training initiatives specifically for young mothers. Sterling handled the legal framework, ensuring every young woman who came to us would be protected from family members who might try to interfere or reclaim children they'd previously rejected. The Foundation's charter explicitly prevented biological relatives from accessing any benefits or making decisions about participants who'd been abandoned. The media coverage of our foundation work provided a perfect contrast to my parents' criminal trial. While they faced charges for exploiting vulnerable workers, we were featured in positive stories about helping vulnerable young mothers rebuild their lives. The timing wasn't coincidental. Sterling had coordinated the foundation launch to coincide with the peak of my parents' legal troubles, ensuring the public would see the stark difference between their version of family and ours. Within 6 months, we were helping 12 young mothers across Colorado. Each success story felt like honoring Magnolia's memory while proving that chosen family could create more healing than biological family ever had. My father was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and racketeering. My mother received 4 years for her role in the conspiracy. They lost their house, their assets, and their reputation completely. But their greatest loss was never knowing Phoenix, never seeing the incredible man he'd become, never being part of the positive change we were creating in the world. They'd thrown away a treasure to protect a lie, and spent the rest of their lives paying for that choice. Meanwhile, every young mother we helped represented the family we'd chosen to build, the legacy Magnolia had envisioned, and the proof that love multiplies when it's given freely, rather than demanded through blood. 6 months after my parents were sentenced, Sterling found something in Magnolia's papers that changed everything I thought I knew about her decision to save me. Hidden in a sealed envelope marked, "For Aurora, when justice is served," was a letter dated just weeks before her death, along with documents that revealed the real reason she'd been walking through Washington Park that morning. Magnolia hadn't found me by accident. She'd been looking for me specifically. The letter explained everything. She'd known my parents for decades through Denver society circles, had watched them build their empire on others' suffering, and had been secretly documenting their illegal business practices for years. When she learned about a pregnant teenager thrown out by Theodore Whitfield, she'd made it her mission to find me and protect me. But what shocked me most was discovering that her daughter Sage hadn't died in a random car accident. She'd been killed by faulty construction work on a Whitfield Industries project, crushed when an improperly installed walkway collapsed at Denver General Hospital. My father had covered up the safety violation that caused her death, bribing inspectors and hiding evidence to protect his company's reputation. Magnolia had lost her daughter to my father's criminal negligence, then spent 5 years gathering evidence to expose him. Finding me sleeping in that park had been the final piece of her plan. By saving Theodore Whitfield's discarded daughter and raising his grandson to become everything the man himself wasn't, she'd created the perfect revenge while doing genuine good. She'd known that someday my parents would try to claim Phoenix's success, and she'd prepared for that moment by ensuring they'd be destroyed by their own greed and corruption when they finally showed themselves. Every legal protection she'd built around us, every provision in her will, every document Sterling had used to expose their conspiracy had been part of a 2-decade plan for justice. The woman who'd saved my life had been planning my father's downfall from the moment she met me. But her revenge hadn't been cruel or empty. Instead of simply destroying Theodore Whitfield, she'd transformed his abandoned daughter into someone who could create positive change in the world, turned his rejected grandson into a healer who saved lives, and used his own actions to expose the corruption he'd built his life on. Reading her final letter, I realized I'd never just been Aurora Whitfield, the ungrateful daughter who'd betrayed her family. I'd been Magnolia Ashworth's chosen instrument of justice, raised and protected specifically to become someone my father could never claim or control. She'd given me everything I needed to succeed, not just out of kindness, but because my success would be the most poetic punishment for the man who'd killed her daughter and thrown away his own. Every achievement, every moment of happiness, every life Phoenix saved was proof that Theodore Whitfield had lost everything that mattered by trying to protect things that didn't. Magnolia had spent her final years teaching me that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. She'd turned a broken 17-year-old into a successful businesswoman, an abandoned baby into a brilliant surgeon, and a family tragedy into a foundation that would help hundreds of other young mothers. Her revenge was complete, but it had created something beautiful instead of just destroying something ugly. And now I understood why she'd always said that sometimes the family you choose is more powerful than the one you're born into. Understanding Magnolia's true plan changed how I saw everything that had happened. I'd thought I was simply surviving and building a life after being abandoned, but I'd actually been part of a carefully orchestrated campaign for justice that spanned 2 decades. The Ashworth Foundation expanded rapidly as word spread about our work helping young mothers. We opened a second location in Colorado Springs, then a third in Grand Junction. Each facility provided the same comprehensive support Magnolia had given me: safe housing, medical care, education, job training, and legal protection from family members who'd abandoned them. Phoenix established medical partnerships across the state, ensuring every young mother in our program received excellent prenatal care and delivery services. His reputation as Colorado's youngest department head opened doors that might have stayed closed, and he used his influence to create opportunities for others the way Magnolia had created opportunities for us. Sterling developed legal templates that other organizations could use to protect vulnerable young mothers from family exploitation. The model we'd created in Colorado was being replicated in other states, spreading Magnolia's vision of chosen family across the country. The most rewarding part was watching young women like Juniper transform from terrified teenagers into confident mothers and successful professionals. She'd completed her GED, started college courses in nursing, and was raising her daughter in stable housing with a support network that would never abandon her. Every success story felt like honoring both Magnolia's memory and proving that my father's version of family was not only wrong but actively harmful. While he sat in federal prison, The daughter he'd thrown away was creating the kind of family legacy he'd never been capable of building through legitimate means. The media continued following our story, but the narrative had shifted completely. Instead of focusing on family drama or revenge, reporters covered the positive impact we were having on young mothers across Colorado. Profile pieces highlighted Phoenix's medical innovations, the foundation's expansion, and the growing network of support for abandoned pregnant teenagers. My parents became footnotes in their own story, mentioned only as examples of how not to treat family. Their criminal convictions ensured they'd never be able to reclaim any narrative about being loving grandparents denied access to their grandson. The final piece of Magnolia's plan revealed itself on the second anniversary of her death. Sterling discovered she'd established a trust that would activate once the foundation had helped 50 young mothers. That trust contained another $10 million and instructions for creating a scholarship program that would send the children of abandoned teenage mothers to college. She'd thought of everything, including the next generation. The babies born to young mothers in our program would have educational opportunities that would break cycles of poverty and create lasting change in families that chose love over judgment. Standing in the foundation's main facility, watching Juniper help newer arrivals settle into their apartments, I realized that Magnolia's greatest gift hadn't been saving me from sleeping in parks. It had been showing me how to transform personal pain into systemic healing, how to turn individual tragedy into community strength. My father had taught me that family was about power and control, but Magnolia had proven that real family was about protection and growth. The foundation would outlive all of us, continuing to save young mothers who found themselves abandoned and pregnant, ensuring that what happened to me would never happen to them. 5 years later, I stood in the ballroom of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, watching Phoenix give the keynote address at our annual foundation gala. He was announcing our newest initiative, a program providing full medical school scholarships to children born to mothers in our program who wanted to pursue careers in healthcare. The audience included some of the same Denver elite who'd once embraced my parents' sob story about their estranged daughter. But now they applauded the family we'd built through choice rather than blood, the lives we'd saved through compassion rather than exploitation. Juniper sat at our table, now a registered nurse working in the pediatric unit where Phoenix had started his career. Her daughter, Maya, was 4 years old and already showing signs of the intelligence that ran in families who overcame impossible odds. Juniper had become our program coordinator, helping other young mothers navigate the same journey she'd completed successfully. Sterling proposed to me during the gala's closing ceremony, right there on stage in front of 500 people who'd supported our work. He said he wanted to make it official that we were the family we'd chosen to be, not just the family we'd happened to create. The crowd gave us a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. The foundation had helped 237 young mothers across 6 states. Every woman who came to us received the same thing Magnolia had given me: unconditional support, practical resources, and protection from family members who'd abandoned them. The success rate was remarkable, with over 90% completing educational programs and achieving financial independence. My parents were released from prison after serving their full sentences, but they'd lost everything that had once defined them. Their house was sold to pay legal fees and victim restitution. Their social connections had evaporated completely. They moved to a small apartment in a different state, as far from Denver as they could get. They never contacted us again. The foundation's legal protections made any attempt at reconciliation pointless, and their criminal convictions ensured no court would ever grant them access to Phoenix or any role in our lives. They'd chosen their path 27 years ago when they threw me out, and now they were living with the permanent consequences of that choice. But I wasn't thinking about them anymore. The woman who'd once been a scared 17-year-old sleeping in Washington Park was now running a foundation that had saved hundreds of young mothers from the same fate. Phoenix had become not just Colorado's youngest department head, but a nationally recognized pioneer in pediatric cardiac surgery. You know what I learned on this journey? That you really do reap what you sow. My parents planted abandonment and cruelty, so they harvested isolation and disgrace, but I planted love, loyalty, and genuine care, and I harvested a family that would move mountains for each other. Sometimes building your own family from scratch is worth so much more than trying to fix one that never worked right in the first place. If you're one of those people who had to choose between blind loyalty and self-preservation, drop a comment telling me about your experience. And if this story touched you somehow, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because there are so many more people out there discovering that real family is whoever stands by your side when you need them most, not whoever shows up only when you have something they want. Seriously, after everything you heard here, do you think I should feel guilty for becoming exactly what they accused me of being? The girl they threw away like trash became the woman who now controls systems they couldn't imagine. The grandson they tried to claim became the man who'll never know their names. And the question I'll leave you with tonight, maybe that was exactly what needed to happen.